Recently, I had the opportunity to host a tour in Thailand, and while my group was at a botanical garden, we came across a strange tree that I'd never seen before. This tree was producing small brown fruits that didn't look too remarkable, kind of like a little round potato or something. Against my better judgment, I tasted a little bit of this fruit. Never do that, by the way, and wrote down the name of it. It looks like a sapadilla.
Yeah. Very hard.
Very hard, and when it's cracked open,
there you go.
You got some like little seeds in there. There is a fruit to it. On a tour with my wonderful group, hey. Guys. You didn't see this, okay?
For science purposes only.
And I'm gonna spit it out, just in case it's poison. Tastes like a very bland potato. Very powdery. No sweetness, no sourness. Doesn't taste like poison. So maybe it's edible, but I'm not gonna risk it. Can I borrow some of your water, Michael? I didn't think much of it. This was just another fruit out of tens of thousands in the world. When I got back home, I looked up the name of this fruit to find out if I indeed had eaten poison, and kind of, I did. But what else I found out was far more shocking. This fruit, as unassuming as it may look, has an insane history. The tree that it comes from is rooted in legend throughout Asia. And at one point in time, it was incredibly valuable and incredibly sought after by my own country of the USA. It is a fruit that holds an important place in medical history, and yet that history has mostly been forgotten. Well, today, everybody, let's take a moment to remember the Chaulmoogra fruit and its rise and fall as a treatment for leprosy. According to a Burmese legend, a long time ago, there was a king. He was a good king and cared very much for his people. Sadly, one day, he became very sick, and painful sores appeared all over his body. Fearing that his sickness might be contagious, this king exiled himself in order to protect his people. Outside the walls of his kingdom, this poor sick king had to traverse the harsh and dangerous conditions of the forest. When all seemed lost, the gods revealed to him a mysterious hollowed out tree, and the king climbed inside of it for shelter. And then when the king became hungry, the gods told him to eat the fruit of this tree. When he ate this fruit, his sores magically vanished, and the sickness left his body. Triumphantly, the king returned to his kingdom, where he once again ruled, but now with the knowledge of this incredible fruit that can cure such a terrible disease. And that is the legend on how the Chaulmoogra fruit became known as a treatment for leprosy. Leprosy is a disease that has existed since time immemorial. In India, they found a 4,000-year-old skeleton that had evidence of leprosy in its body, and it has likely existed long before then. Leprosy has existed in countries all around the world and is written in many different ancient texts. The Bible alone references leprosy 68 times. That may be why the word leprosy conjures up an image of a disease from antiquity. However, leprosy is still very much a problem today.
there are over 200,000 new cases of leprosy occurring every year. The main places that have this problem are India and Brazil, but there are also new cases every year occurring right here where I live in the USA. And the reason why it happens here in the USA is weird.
The spike in leprosy cases in Florida due to people touching armadillos,
which I will get into later in the episode. Leprosy attacks the body in three ways: the mucous membranes, the skin, and the nerves. Symptoms affecting the mucous membranes include a stuffy nose and nosebleeds. That's not so bad. Symptoms affecting the skin include discoloration, patchy dryness, redness, ulcers, lesions, and growths. That's a bit worse. Symptoms that affect the nerves include numbness of the skin, muscle weakness, and paralysis. Okay, that's pretty bad. And where it gets worse is that these are just the initial symptoms. If left untreated, those symptoms snowball into something far worse. The problems with the mucous membranes can further affect the respiratory system, causing difficulty breathing and alterations in speech. The skin problems over time can spread across the entire body and completely disfigure a person. And when it reaches the face, it can affect the eyes, causing blindness. Because it affects the nerves by causing numbness in the body, people affected by leprosy are more susceptible to injury and may not notice a problem when it occurs. This can lead to fingers, toes, or even the nose being injured and then reabsorbed into the body. With advanced stages of leprosy, it is very common for limbs to be lost due to those injuries. But it gets worse. The worst thing about leprosy, at least in my opinion, is not the physical issues, it is the social stigma around it. I know that's easy for me to say as somebody who does not have leprosy, but yeah, hear me out on this one. If you look up the word leper in a thesaurus, you will see synonyms for somebody who is undesirable, unclean, and sinful. Historically, people affected by leprosy were not being viewed as somebody affected by a terrible disease. They were viewed by others as somebody who was being punished by God. In many countries, people affected by leprosy were viewed as literal monsters. In China, if you had leprosy, you were seen as the embodiment of evil. And the only way to cure that evil was to either burn the person with leprosy at the stake or to bury them alive. In Yemen, it was very common for sailors to get this disease, and if they got it, they would be thrown overboard or they would be left to die in the desert. This led to local legends of zombie-like creatures roaming the desert, feeding on human blood and brains. These were just poor, sick, dying people who had leprosy. In medieval Europe, people with leprosy were considered to be officially dead. Those people would be given funeral rites and then banished from their community. Leprosy sufferers were forced to wear signs, ring bells, or shout unclean in order to warn other people of their approach. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair on his head hang loose. And he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Leviticus 13:45. That Old Testament does not mess around. Not unlike having a witch's mark, somebody with leprosy would often be used as a scapegoat for a community's problems. Misattributing the reason why something happens is known as a causal fallacy. For instance, let's say your neighbor Joe develops red dry patches on his skin, and your baddie grandmother tells you, Joe has been cursed by God, that's why his skin looks like that. A few days later, your cow dies. If you believe that Joe's skin condition is the reason why your cow died, instead of the fact that you've been feeding your cow nothing but cola and Pop Rocks, that is a causal fallacy. Remember this concept because it is going to show up again later in the episode. Because of this disease, a well-respected member of society can fall to become a deformed outcast. And this is all due to no fault of their own. Now, you may think that these social issues are a problem from the past, but unfortunately, that is not true. A lot of people around the world with leprosy are still being feared and shunned by their own communities. According to the United Nations, there are still over 100 discrimination laws towards sufferers of leprosy on the books today. These laws include forced isolation and imprisonment, not being allowed to vote, not being allowed to ride public transportation, immediately being able to dissolve a marriage if your spouse has leprosy, denial of visas, permits, and even citizenship for a person, and it can be grounds for dismissal for a person's job. Discriminatory laws persist in the Bahamas, Barbados, Dominica, Egypt, India, Jamaica, Malaysia, Mali, Malta, Myanmar, Namibia, Nepal, Niger, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Senegal, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, Thailand, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States of America. That report is from 2022. And as a little spoiler, today we have an effective, cheap, and widely available cure for leprosy. So there is no reason for those discriminatory laws to exist. These social stigmas are still a problem, and they are probably the biggest problem with leprosy today. Because even if somebody has access to the cure, they still have to deal with other people. The word leprosy has such a negative connotation that the scientific community has actually renamed it to Hansen's disease. They literally could have named it anything else and be better than that. Okay, so it was actually named after the Norwegian scientists that discovered the cause of leprosy in 1873. As it turns out, leprosy is not caused by sin, it is caused by a bacteria known as Mycobacterium leprae, which is actually in the same genus as the bacteria that causes tuberculosis. Now that is a fun fact. Leprosy is contagious, however, there is some good news and some bad news about it. The bad news is that it can take years for symptoms to appear, and this makes it very difficult for somebody to trace back exactly how they contracted the leprosy. The good news is that even though it has the reputation for being highly contagious, it isn't. It's unlikely for somebody to contract this from another person. You'd have to be in very close contact with them for an extended period of time. You might get it from your spouse, but you're not going to get it from sitting next to somebody on a plane. And even then, most people have a natural immunity to the leprosy-causing bacteria. The incorrect belief that leprosy was highly contagious is where we get one of the earliest forms of treatment. Now, I say treatment rather than treatment because this was less of a way to help the person who is affected with leprosy and more of a way to keep them away from other people. They were either placed in specialized asylums or leper colonies. I do realize that I'm doing a lot of this today, a lot of scare quotes, and there is a good reason for that. It's because a lot of these things are things that you're not really supposed to say, and leper is one of them. Today, this is considered to be a derogatory word, and I mean, it makes sense. It's like if someone has cancer, you wouldn't say to them like, oh, well, we're gonna call you Cancer Boy now. Don't take offense to it, it's just so we know to stay away from you. Yeah, it's kind of messed up. The more accepted word for a leper colony is a lacerium or a lazaretto. I'm going to say lazaretto because it is more fun to say. Lazarettos existed all around the world, and they ranged from being little more than a prison to a fully functioning town. Usually these were kept further away from the rest of society, so it'd be like on an island or in an area that was difficult to get to. This was done to protect people who were outside of the lazaretto, and one interesting thing that I found out is that often they would have their own form of currency. This was so there'd be no accidental mixing between regular currency and the currency used within the lazarettos. You cannot get leprosy from touching one of these coins. I am touching one right now. I'm not concerned. But people were afraid it was so contagious that just handling the same coin that somebody with leprosy held would give you leprosy. Leprosy was once very common. So common that in the 12th century, there were estimated to be over 19,000 lazarettos in Europe alone. That is a lot, but that number thankfully dropped drastically as the centuries went on, and mostly that is due to improvements in sanitation. However, isolation was still the main form of treatment all the way up until the early 20th century. Although isolation was the main form of treatment in the West, in the East they had something else. Chaulmoogra is in the Hydnocarpus genus, and there are several different species in this genus, but 3 of them stand out for being the most popular as a treatment for leprosy. In Burma and Thailand, they use Hydnocarpus curzi. In India, they use Hydnocarpus pandandra, and in China, they use Hydnocarpus anthelmentica. These fruits have different common names in the areas where they are from. However, these common names are often used interchangeably for the different species of Hydnocarpus, which made it very confusing while I was researching this episode. Wasn't always sure what species was being spoken about. However, essentially these fruits have been used in the same sort of way, and they have the same kind of chemical composition. So for convenience, I'm going to refer to everything as Chaulmoogra. Also because it's fun to say. The first mention of this fruit being used as a leprosy cure goes all the way back to the ancient Sanskrit text, the Samhruta Samhita. It is argued just how old this text is, but there are estimates that go between 1000 BCE all the way to 500 CE. Let's put it this way, some of the earliest surviving versions of this text are handwritten on palm leaves. It's pretty old. Anyway, this is what it says about the Chaulmoogra. The pith or marrow of the fruits should be carefully collected in the rainy season, dried, and pounded. The oil should be either pressed out of these seeds in a mill in the manner of preparing sesame oil, or squeezed out of a bag like that used in the case of safflower. The oil should be boiled over a fire so as to have its inherent watery particles completely evaporated. Then it should be placed in a pitcher and buried for a fortnight in a heap of well-dried cow dung. This oil should be given to the patient in the morning, while a cold gruel should be given to him in the afternoon. The use of this oil should be repeated in the same manner for 5 days. The patient should avoid anger and live on mung bean soup and boiled rice for a fortnight. A 5 days use of this oil would ensure the cure of every type of skin disease. That seems fair enough, but you should know that this text goes on to say that if you consume Chaulmoogra oil regularly with chicken soup, you will live for 200 years. And if you take that same Chaulmoogra oil and instead you administer it nasally, you will live for 300 years. So yeah, maybe take that ancient medical advice with just a grain of salt. Nonetheless, Chaulmoogra oil is still a popular ingredient in Ayurvedic medicine. The Sanskrit word for Chaulmoogra is Kastavari, which literally translates to the enemy of skin diseases. Although it's been used for thousands of years in Asia, it only aroused interest in the Western world in 1854. At that time, a British surgeon, Frederick J. Muat, was employed at the Bengal Medical College in Calcutta. Muat was researching some of the native plants, and that is how he was introduced to the Chaulmoogra. In the medical periodical, the Indian Annals of Medical Science, Muat published the results of one case where he personally treated a patient with leprosy. Case 1, an unfortunate Creole of Bourbon, who had long been an inmate of the leper asylum, was picked up in the streets in a state of insensibility and brought by the police to the medical college hospital. He was found to be laboring under the effects of alcohol. His body was covered in livid patches, the toes of his left foot were without nails and swollen at the extremities. Upon the sole of his foot were 3 large, ragged, excavated ulcers with hardened, livid edges and an offensive, sanural, purulent discharge. Oh good. One of them, near the heel, was the size of a rupee and had destroyed the skin, fascia, and muscles, and exposed the bones beneath them. Ugh. There was a similar ulcer on the sole of the right foot, and on the dorsum of both feet were excoriations of a leprous character. He was laboring under diarrhea and great general debility. After cleaning the surface of the ulcers, I dressed them every day with the oil of Chaulmoogra and gave him internally a pill of the seed beaten into a pulp. For nearly a fortnight there was no perceptible amendment, but after this the progress of the cure was rapid. The ulcers healed by healthy granulation, the livid spots gradually disappeared, the general health of the patient improved, and he declared that he was better than he had been for some years previously. He left the hospital clandestinely on the 10th of September, 1853, and I have not heard of him since. Not long after this report was published, Chaulmoogra oil became a main treatment used in the West, and it became the main treatment used in the USA. The US didn't have nearly as much of an outbreak of leprosy cases as other parts of the world, but it still had them, and it still had lazarettos. There were 2 big lazarettos in the US. One of them was in Louisiana, which, fun fact, still exists today, but now it is a leprosy research facility instead of a lazaretto. And the other one was on the island of Molokai. The island of Molokai is in Hawaii, and at the time it was referred to, quite cruelly, as the land of the living death. Leprosy was a big concern in Hawaii, and it was there that several advancements were about to happen. This is the Chaulmoogra Seed, and this is really the star of the show. There is a little bit of talk here and there of people using the pulp of the Chaulmoogra, but really not so much. This is what people wanted. And how this was used traditionally is, well, either this was squeezed to get an oil extracted from it, and that Chaulmoogra oil would be used, or this would be powdered and then mixed with another kind of fat, like clarified butter. The oil or the fat would then be applied externally to any kind of sign of leprosy, so dried skin, red skin, things like that. This was also used internally, and for that, they would just eat it, basically. The oil or the powder mixed with some other thing would be taken internally. I believe that inside of this there is a kernel, and I believe that because, listen to this. You can hear it. There's something in there. So let's crack into this. Okay, easier said than done. I'm gonna get another one. Okay, I got another one, and this one already has a crack in it, so I can get into this one a lot easier. So I'm just gonna peel off the outer shell, and there is the kernel. Even dried out as this one is, it does seem to have some oil content in there. That's fun. And let's see, can I break this in half? Oh, yes, I can. And yeah, you can see the oil content in there. This smells very earthy, and I'm not especially interested in eating this, but you know, for science, I'm going to touch my tongue to it. I don't recommend anyone do this. It's like licking a stone. And that is where my curiosity ends. I could take that, pop it in my mouth, and crunch away at it, but I am not going to. And that's mostly because I've been reading a lot about Chaulmoogra, and there is an autobiography that was written by a Dr. Heiser. Dr. Heiser was in charge of leprosy patients at a lazaretto in the Philippines. And in his autobiography, he says this: "The drug had to be taken by mouth, and most patients became so nauseated that only 1 out of 300 could retain the oil over a period long enough to be effective. The poor lepers would say, "Doctor, I'd rather have leprosy than take another dose." Dr. Heiser went on to theorize that the most effective way to administer Chaulmoogra oil was by injection. So he experimented with this, but was faced with several hurdles. A big one is that when you inject Chaulmoogra oil into the body, it does not absorb. Instead, it just kind of like sits there and ulcerates under the skin. So in order to try and get this to absorb into the body, Heiser experimented with taking the Chaulmoogra oil, mixing it with other things, and then injecting it. By doing this, he found out that by mixing Chaulmoogra oil with camphor, it would absorb. But even then, he was not super satisfied with the results. It wasn't really working the way he hoped that it would. In 1904, there was another breakthrough. During this time, a chemist, a Dr. Frederick Power, discovered that Chaulmoogra oil contained two unique chemical compounds. He named these Chaulmoogric acid and Hydnocarpic acid. He believed that these were the effective ingredients in the oil. In 1915, an improved injectable version of Chaulmoogra was developed by, get this, a 23-year-old African-American woman named Alice Ball. In 1915, which is incredible. Now, how this came to happen is Alice Ball had recently graduated from the University of Hawaii. Her master thesis, which was on the chemical properties of kava, fell into the hands of a Dr. Harry Holman. Dr. Holman was working at a leprosy research facility in Hawaii, and he was so impressed with Ball's work, he contacted her and asked if she would find a way of trying to solve this problem of not being able to inject Chaulmoogra oil. So what Alice Ball did is, through tireless research, she found a way to isolate the Chaulmoogric acid and the Hydnocarpic acid in ethyl esters. This made them water soluble, so they then could be injected into the body and absorbed. After a great deal of experimental work, Miss Ball solved the problem for me by making ethyl esters of the fatty acids found in Chaulmoogra oil. 84 patients who have been on the treatment have become bacteriologically negative and free from all lesions of the disease and have been discharged from segregation. Are you surprised that in 1915, a 23-year-old African-American woman could be celebrated for a medical breakthrough? Well, be ready to be far less surprised and more disappointed, because there's some bad news. Shortly after developing this method, Alice Ball tragically died. She died at the young age of 24. How she died is kind of mysterious. There are two stories, depending on where you look. One is that she died of tuberculosis. The other is that she died from a freak lab accident, and she died from chlorine poisoning as a result of that. But what is known is that after she died, the then head of the chemistry department of the University of Hawaii, and Arthur Dean, he swooped in and published her findings as his own. I believe he did help her a bit along the way, like he was involved to some degree, but he didn't credit her whatsoever. And the resulting esters of this process, he called them Dean's derivatives. Alice Ball's work in the development of these esters would have been completely forgotten. However, in the 1970s, evidence was found showing that she was in fact the main person behind this process. There have been many articles written about her, a short film was made about her recently, and in 2022, the governor of Hawaii dedicated February 28th as Alice Augusta Ball Day.
To hereby proclaim February 28, 2022 as Alice Augusta Ball Day.
I don't want to diminish what Alice Ball did. However, However, a lot of articles written about her blow what she did out of proportion. They make it seem like she single-handedly discovered the acids in Chaulmoogra, and by doing that, created a cure for leprosy. You will see those words a lot. Alice Ball discovered the cure for leprosy. She did not. Chaulmoogra oil was never a cure for leprosy, it was a treatment. And what she did was an improvement on that treatment, but it was not a cure. And she did not discover how those acids came to be. That we talked about that. That was that other guy. She was tasked in finding a way to take Chaulmoogra oil and make it injectable. And she did that, which is impressive. And the fact that she did that in 1915 as a 23-year-old African-American woman is incredible. Now let's talk about Arthur Dean for a minute. I know, he sucks. However, Arthur Dean did continue the research about Chaulmoogra oil and the derivatives from Chaulmoogra oil after Alice Ball died. And one thing that he did that nobody did up to this point is he had a clinical trial. The morale of patients in the hospital is excellent, and in striking contrast to the former days when a leprous person was doomed to a long term of isolation, in most cases to be terminated only by death. This, everybody, is Moogral. Moogral is one of a handful of medications that came out based on the work that Alice Ball did. This is made from the ethyl esters of Hydnocarpus oil. It says it right on the box. And you may notice that I have it in a little baggie. And that is because this thing stinks. I will take it out of the baggie so you can get a better look. And mind you, there's no medication in here. This has an empty bottle in there. There's nothing in there. You know, if you go to the dentist and they give you Novocaine and it has like that kind of smell to it, it smells kind of like that. It smells like a numbing spray or numbing solution of some kind. Stabilized with 4% creosote. Creosote is, I think it's a derivative of coal tar. While I was looking up information about Arthur Dean, I managed to find out that he was researching creosote, and he wrote papers about it. So the reason why there is creosote in Chaulmoogra medications very well might be because of him. Good stuff, good stuff. And that is something you are meant to inject into your skin. Protect from light, from burrows, welcome. There's also another one, I forget the name of it, but Bayer produced it around the same time. So this happened. They made it. This is a thing that existed back in the day. Going back in the bag. According to the instructions that came with my little bottle of stinky Moogral, injections are usually given at weekly intervals. Not more than 5 cc's should be injected intradermally at any one time. About 0.1 cc's should be injected at each point in the lesion. If the lesions are so small or so few that 5 cc's cannot be injected into them, the balance is given intramuscularly. Intramuscularly. That is hard to say. Although Chaulmoogra was said to work, nobody knew exactly why it worked. There were 2 main theories though. The first theory is that when you would inject Chaulmoogra into the body would send enzymes to try to break it down. And when they would try to break down the Chaulmoogra, it would also break down the cell wall of the Mycobacterium leprae. The second theory is that injecting this causes such irritation to that part of the body that natural defenses are sent by your body in order to attack it. And when that happens, it also attacks the Mycobacterium leprae. Both have a similar thing going on. Your body is sending the good stuff in order to attack it, and that attacks the bacteria that causes leprosy. Either way, there finally was a manufactured treatment for leprosy. There was another problem though. Medicines using Chaulmoogra were being developed in the West. However, the Chaulmoogra itself was being sourced in India, Burma, and Thailand. And this product was in short supply, very expensive, and also is often adulterated with other things. In order to meet the demand for this medicine, the USDA decided to try and grow Chaulmoogra right here in the USA. In the 1920s, Joseph Rock, who was a professor of botany at the University of Hawaii, again we are talking about Hawaii, he was enlisted to go to Asia and bring back Chaulmoogra seeds. He wrote an article for National Geographic where he gives a detailed and fascinating account of his adventure to try and find this tree. It reads like an adventure story. After 2 days marching through dense forest and crossing the Kodin stream many times, we reached the village of Gyeongkyu. First we encountered a dense Diptocarpus forest, then one of bamboo, and finally we reached pure strands of the genuine Chaulmoogra tree. But alas, no fruit. Oh dude, I've been there. Headman of the village informed me that there had been a very poor crop of seed here, but added that a village some miles further had a very good one the year before, so I decided to proceed thither. We passed through vegetation similar to that of Gyeongkyu until we struck the Chaulmoogra forests. There we separated into smaller parties and the seed collecting began in earnest. Loaded with seeds, we started down the steep hillsides, which are covered with Chaulmoogra trees, glad at heart that at last I had been successful. After 11 months of exploring what was then Burma, Siam, and Assam, Joseph Rock successfully brought Chaulmoogra seeds back to Hawaii. He went on to be a celebrated botanical explorer, spent most of the rest of his life in China, and he tracked down tens of thousands of rare plants and he introduced a lot of them to the US. 100 acres of land were set aside on the island of Oahu to be a plantation for Chaulmoogra. And after about a decade, the trees matured, and the US was now producing its own Chaulmoogra fruit. As we approach the end of this story, it is time to throw in a twist. Remember how I said earlier about causal fallacies, you know, when you misattribute the reason why something is happening to the wrong thing? And I said that I would be bringing this up again later. Now is the time. You see, this entire time that Chaulmoogra was getting success as a treatment and people were talking about it in the scientific community, people were also very skeptical about it. This is a skepticism that existed way back at its introduction to the West, when Muat, the guy who enthusiastically wrote about his one case study where he treated a drunk guy with Chaulmoogra oil, so he published that with a warning. It is manifestly impossible to attempt to generalize from a single case how much of the improvement was due to the regularity and nourishing diet of the hospital and what proportion the cure may fairly be assigned to the remedy. The result is, I venture to believe, sufficiently encouraging to justify a further trial of the Chaulmoogra in leprosy. Muat urged doctors and scientists to do their own research, and since then, many of them did. Some of them were very satisfied with their results. Others weren't. Questions arose among the medical community about how many of the successes were actually due to the effects of Chaulmoogra and what was being attributed to the wrong thing. In 1942, G.W. McCoy, who was the former medical director of the United States Public Health Service, he wrote an article that completely ripped apart the idea that Chaulmoogra was useful for anything. He examined the results of many of the people who were promoting Chaulmoogra's use and found that their studies were very often faulty. Among the studies that he tore apart was the clinical trial that Arthur Dean conducted. In order to get another opinion, McCoy reached out to 4 respected leprologists. These doctors collectively had seen hundreds of patients suffering with leprosy, and they had used Chaulmoogra. All of them had a lot of problems with it. My opinion is that Chaulmoogra oil, or its derivatives, have not been shown to be of any specific value in the treatment of leprosy. I make the above statement with full knowledge that many patients seem to have improved while under the treatment of this drug. However, others have not shown improvement, and additional patients have shown equal improvement while under the administration of other oils or esters, and under a regimen of personal and institutional hygiene without the administration of any oil. So could it be that this entire time, people's leprosy symptoms were improving not because of the Chaulmoogra, but because of the other things that may have come with it while they were in the care of a hospital? What I think, and by the way, I say this as a YouTuber who has no medical background and essentially knows nothing about anything. What I think is that Chaulmoogra probably helped a little bit. Hydnocarpus species have been used for thousands of years by many different countries. When it was introduced to the West and doctors started using it, many people, they were encouraged by the results they saw. So I feel like that maybe is a bit more than just a causal fallacy, that there might be something to it that is helpful, if it's just something simple like an antibacterial property or something like that. But whatever it is, I don't think it was nearly as good as people thought. I think there was a lot of problems with this treatment, and it definitely was not a cure for leprosy. It was just something that was helping the symptoms of leprosy. I try to be a rather rational person, and I can appreciate that what I am saying might be biased. I have spent over a month researching this topic, and to come all the way to the end and find out that Chaulmoogra maybe wasn't actually useful for anything, it's hard. It's hard to accept that. And maybe you watching this far, even in your own way, you watched all this big episode and now you're like, what, it doesn't actually do anything? It's kind of a downer. You want it to do something. Well, imagine the trained researchers here. Imagine the doctors and the scientists and the chemists who were putting all this effort into the Chaulmoogra, years of research of their lives, only to find out that maybe it wasn't actually good for anything. It takes a lot of strength to push away years of research because you found out that maybe it doesn't work. That is why it's so important to have a clinical trial. And since the Chaulmoogra never had a legitimate clinical trial, we have to push it aside. We have to move on. The first scientifically proven cure for leprosy is something called dapsone. Dapsone does not have a sexy story behind it. There's no epic tale of somebody fighting off tigers and trying to track down the tree. There are no legends where kings are being cured of their disease by the gods. No. It was synthesized in a lab by a man named Emil Fromm. Emil Fromm was working on synthetic dyes, and while he was researching synthetic dyes, he came across the thing that would become dapsone. Dapsone was discovered in 1908, however, it wasn't until the 1930s when its use as an antimicrobial agent was realized. Dapsone was not a perfect cure. Treatment could take years in order to cure somebody who had early stages of leprosy, and for those who had advanced stages of leprosy, very often they would have to remain on this treatment for the rest of their lives. It would never fully cure for most people, it would just keep the symptoms down. Worse over, the Mycobacterium leprae would often mutate and become resistant to the dapsone, so it might stop working. One of the biggest hurdles with developing a cure for leprosy is that, historically, it has been seen as a purely human disease. You had to test them on human patients. Because of that, it made things very slow. In the 1960s, though, there was a major breakthrough. At this time, it was found that mice specifically could hold leprosy in the pads of their feet. So scientists were able to develop more powerful and more effective treatments for leprosy by testing them on the toe beans of mice. In the 1970s, there was another big breakthrough in the treatment of leprosy when it was discovered that some species of armadillo can contract leprosy. So this led to further animal testing and further advancements in the drugs. And by the way, I feel like this should go without saying, but don't touch armadillos, guys. If you see a wild armadillo, don't try and take a selfie with it. I feel like I shouldn't have to say that. However, in recent years, there has been an uptick in the cases of people getting leprosy in the United States because they keep messing with armadillos. Stop. In 1981, a highly effective cure for leprosy was developed. This is the same cure that is used to this day, or like something very similar to it. It is a multi-drug treatment using 3 drugs: dapsone, rifampicin, and clofazimine. These drugs are both easy and cheap to produce, so you can take these, mass amounts of these, and spread them all around the world to places where they really need it, where there's a lot of cases of leprosy. It doesn't matter how poor you are, everybody can get this treatment for free. And not only that, it is far more effective than dapsone on its own. Instead of taking potentially an entire lifetime with these new treatments, it takes only 6 months to completely cure somebody who has early onset leprosy, and it takes only 2 years to cure somebody who has advanced leprosy. Since it was introduced in 1981, 16 million people have been cured, completely cured of leprosy with multi-drug treatment. One of my sources for this episode was an article that came out by the World Health Organization way back in 1996. This came out at a very interesting time, because at this point, multi-drug treatment was being used for about 15 years, and leprosy cases were drastically dropping. People were really excited about it, and the World Health Organization set up a decision to try and bring an end to leprosy as a world health concern by the year 2000. In order to reach that status, there would have to be less than 1 leprosy sufferer per 10,000 people. That was their goal. At the time that they set that goal, that was not a reality. But since then, they succeeded. The World Health Organization now has a new campaign, a strategy towards zero leprosy. They hope to bring an end to this terrible disease once and for all. No longer having cases at all, no new cases of leprosy, but also to help people who might be suffering from the effects of leprosy. Even if you have the cure, if you had advanced leprosy where you lost a limb, you're not going to grow that limb back. And beyond that, they also are trying to attack social stigma surrounding leprosy, doing things that involve, getting rid of some of these discriminatory laws, things like that. This is an incredibly aggressive campaign, and they make regular updates about it. Right now, they're in a phase where they are hoping to reduce new cases of leprosy by 70% by the year 2030. Even though leprosy now has an effective cure, there are still active lazarettos all around the world. This is not so much because they need treatment. Some of them might have some disabilities because of the leprosy and need some treatment from that, but mostly because it's their home and it's somewhere where they feel safe.
This gentleman here in the blue hat, he's like the mayor, the head honcho here in this village.
Clearly, there is still a lot of misinformation about leprosy out there. To be honest, before I came across this fruit and it sent me down this rabbit hole, I didn't know that much about it. And I'm guessing a lot of people watching this, before you watch this video, you maybe didn't know that much about leprosy, and now you know too much about leprosy like me. And hey, if you want to do your part, do what I've been doing. As somebody who has too many facts in their head about leprosy and just needs to get them out, bring it up to your friends, bring it up to your family, have a dinner party, bring up leprosy, talk to people on the street about it, talk to people on the subway about it. Let people know all about leprosy because they will love you for it. Spread the information and people will start to know more about it and know the reality behind this disease. Scientific sources today rarely mention the Chaulmoogra fruit besides an occasional footnote. And I think that does make sense. You know, there is aggressive action being taken right now to bring an end to leprosy once and for all, and to have an unproven alternative medicine like Chaulmoogra oil, this might stray somebody from getting a cure that actually works, that is proven. So it does make sense that the scientific community might not want to talk about this. Maybe they want to sweep Chaulmoogra and its history under the rug. And in case it hasn't been apparent, I'm not making this video because I want people to use Chaulmoogra. I don't think people should be using Chaulmoogra for serious things like leprosy. As far as historical interest though, Chaulmoogra is not a footnote. It is not a chapter. It is the main character in the story on how people have been fighting leprosy. It has been there since the very beginning as a treatment for leprosy. It's been around for thousands of years. Sure, a different hero ended up coming in to save the day. Multi-drug therapy is a deus ex machina that swung in at the very end of the story in order to save the day when nothing else would. Whether or not Chaulmoogra worked, it is a fascinating piece of history. It is a piece of history that I don't think should be forgotten. And right now, we are once again at a very interesting point in the story of leprosy, because we are at a point where in your lifetime, in my lifetime, that story might come to an end. I would like to give a big thank you to Smarter Everyday, Bill T, and Joseph McCorkle. They are mega patrons on patreon.com. Patreon is how I keep this channel going. It is a huge help, so thank you. And to anyone watching who is interested in learning more about how you can support the channel and get some really cool bonuses in return, like early access to videos, exclusive videos, there's over 100 of those. There's even a level where I will send you things in the mail. You gotta check it out. So check out the link in the description below.